So thank you for joining. I'm here this morning with, and of course, here comes a few more folks. That's great. Diane Hullet. And we're going to have an interesting conversation about end of life and how it may, how the focus of that maybe helps us live a little bit more now. I think that's where we're going. But before we do that, I'll do the obligatory, where the hell are we in the market? I have been offline for 2 months. Thank you for giving me a vacation for talking about this. Actually, the last 2 months were fairly, at least from a stock market or bond market perspective, relatively uneventful. Things are starting to get interesting now, kind of typical sort of things slowed down in the summer, and now things are starting to pick up again. And the market's trying to figure out where we're going, and the Fed, and who is, as many of you have heard me talk about this before, a big player naturally in impacting how things get priced in the market. And so the last couple of days, we've had a little taper tantrum redo come back. Things have sold off a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on where I think this is going. I don't know where it's going. The short answer is I don't know where it's going. There's certainly, there are two sides of this coin, and two sides, at least two different positions being debated about, is inflation really a problem, and is it going to be a problem, and is that going to force the Fed to actually ultimately raise interest rates? Or is this a transient phenomena that is going to resolve once more supply comes back online, and once growth such as it is slows down? I have been in the transient camp right along, which means nothing because I've been wrong on inflation for almost 15 years. So maybe this is the time. I've been waiting for it to come back, and then I finally lost hope. It's not coming back. So now it is. So now I don't believe it is. It's hard to say where we're going. I will say that the thing I'm watching, and the thing I would invite you to watch if you care to, is how the bond market responds. And what I mean by that, one of the things I keep an eye on is what is the 10-year Treasury rate doing? Is the yield rising, or is the yield falling? So some of you may recall in the early part of this year when it looked like growth was we were just gonna get like shot out of a cannon on growth. The yield on the 10-year Treasury note jumped to about 175 basis points, 1.75%. It then backed back off again over several months and got back down to about 126 basis points, which is where we sit today, or 1.26%. If that begins to rise again and rises sustainably, what that means is people are selling out of bonds, interest rates, and entities are selling out of bonds. Interest rates, the yield begins to rise. I would argue that that's a pretty good indication that the bond market at least thinks that inflation is here to stay, and it will be daring the Fed to raise rates. Why do I care about the bond market, and why does that matter? The bond market is about something like 5 times the size of the stock market. And historically, the bond market has been relatively accurate in predicting sort of the direction of growth and predicting over time the growth, the rising or falling of interest rates. We'll see if that's the case this time, but that's what I'm keeping my eye on. And what's the impact to portfolios? On the bond side of your portfolio, those of you who are clients of ours, it will have very little impact because we have been extremely conservative in our bond holdings. We've stayed on what's called the short end of the curve, meaning we're holding mostly short-term treasuries. We don't have a lot of things that are going to be impacted if interest rates rise. They will not be impacted negatively. On the stock side, when interest rates rise, the cost of money changes, and how you calculate the relative value of a growth stock has an impact. This is why you see the headlines that growth stocks sell off or the NASDAQ sells off as interest rates go up, or the fear of interest rates going up. The companies we hold are very high quality companies. They're very long-term holds. We are not holding companies that are extremely overpriced relative to their earnings. So it doesn't mean that they won't take a hit. They will, because when things start to sell off, everything goes. But we're not concerned about changing the relative mix of what we hold in terms of growth stock versus dividend stocks. We're holding high quality companies with very high ESG ratings for the long term. So this near-term volatility at this point, it's not making us want to make any changes. The only thing we did at the beginning of the year, in a nod to the idea that, maybe Mag's wrong about that inflation piece, is we added a small position in inflation-protected treasuries, which will benefit if, in fact, inflation proves to be not just a passing trend. And it has benefited slightly in the portfolio. So I say that to say, I think the next few weeks or months could get pretty interesting. We've been due for more volatility in the market. We've had very little, but at this moment, it is not giving us opportunity, or it's not giving us a pause in terms of a rethink. So all steady at the moment, and that's pretty much my report. So I want to move to the topic of today, which I find really, really interesting. When Diane and I connected, when she reached out and said she was doing this work, I was like, oh, this is cool. We need to get her on a webinar. So I'm really happy you're here, Diane.
Thanks, Maggie.
We met many years ago. We are both members of an organization called the Women Donors Network. Diane was a very early member in that group. You hired the first CEO, who's been there nearly 20 years. I am now the board chair on the other end of that, 28. And you were a board chair too, I think, in this organization.
Yes, correct.
But we connected on a lot of other levels when we met. And so I'm going to read a little bit from your website just to give folks a background. Diane, for many years, was a classroom teacher in middle and high school English, and a painting teacher, which is cool. Became a mom at 40, which kept her busy for maybe like the last, 10 or 15 years, I think. But was involved with a lot of facilitation with groups and volunteer projects. But when her father-in-law was nearing the end of his life, a chaplain with hospice helped the family, which inspired her to think about how she could do something like that. So about 10 years later, a friend told her about a course she had just completed called with the Conscious Dying Institute. Mm-hmm. And the course was called Sacred Passage End of Life Doula. And signed up, took the course. One course led to another. And she has now started her own course called Best 3 Months. She does the course on Zoom, and in her probably not very much spare time, I'm guessing, she sews, walks, bikes, cooks, reads, and lives in Boulder, Colorado. So Diane, I will turn it over to you. And I thank you so much for being here. And folks, if you do have questions, Diane was just in the chat. Feel free to chat some questions, and we'll try and leave a few minutes at the end for us to for you to ask any questions you have. So hit it, Diane.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks, Maggie. And thanks for everyone being here. Can everyone hear me okay? Is my sound okay?
You sound good.
Seems like it. Okay, great. I said to some people at the beginning, I'm terribly raspy, and I apologize. I'll probably be coughing. I'm at the end of a summer cold that kind of nailed me in the last 10 days, but I will do my best to project and drink a little water as we go. As Maggie said, feel free to type questions in the chat. Maggie, interrupt me with any questions, and we'll have time at the end as well. So, thanks for the intro. It's exciting to be here. I never in my wildest dreams thought that at 56, I would kind of reinvent myself and start this entirely new business. And yet it's just been one of those pivots that has felt absolutely right. And I think that, the pandemic has put the immediacy of our mortality kind of on everyone's radar in a way that I think we were a little bit holding it at arm's length in our culture. Of course, there are communities, there are families in the U.S. that have hold grief and loss and death very closely and do a good job with it. But there is a whole lot of denial and frustration and fear, anger. I mean, almost everybody has had a difficult experience around death. Many people have had positive experiences as well. But I think this is just kind of a cultural moment where there is this positive death movement happening, and there's a lot of activity and a lot of interest. And it's maybe partly that, you know, the boomers, if you want to call them that, are coming of an age where they're starting to really look their mortality in the eye. And they're like, hold on, we don't want to do what has been done. And we don't want to have what our grandparents had or our parents had in terms of end of life. So there's just a lot in this area. I mean, you can Google all kinds of things about this. What was interesting to me was to take this course that was about being an end-of-life doula, and the phrase death doula has become this term. There was just a great article about it in the New York Times. It's kind of on people's radar. But for me, the angle became education. I thought, oh, wait a minute, I want to have conversations. You know, it's not so much that I'm sitting vigil at someone's bedside right now. I'm much more just interested in this engagement of conversation, and what happens when we kind of open the door and begin to talk about this. Again, some families, some friends, some partners do that well. Others say, well, I have some ideas in my mind, but I've never really told anybody. So that's kind of some of my background. Let's kind of just launch in. If people can type into the chat, just type in a word or phrase. What brings you here today? Like, what about this was interesting to you? And we'll just kind of see who's out there. So I'll talk a little. Maggie can jump in. We'll have time for questions at the end. You know, this is more of a conversation than a presentation. I was kind of laughing with Liz beforehand. I was like, well, I could talk for an hour. I could also talk for 10 minutes and we could just see what happens. So what brings you here today? Great. Terrific. Yeah, I think in Maggie's work, this comes up a lot. And with Maggie's book, and just your entire philosophy kind of about meaning and how do you really live in the meaning in your life and put your money to work for the meaning in your life.
Yeah.
That really brings this whole question forward.
Yeah, I will just say that one of the things that jumped out at me when we were talking the first time when we were discussing you coming on was I used to do this, and I still occasionally do a kind of workshop, and there's a central piece of the workshop which is really a meditation on death, in the sense of, like, you know, you ask these 3 questions. I got these 3 questions from a guy named George Kinder years and years ago, but they've been circulating. You know, what if you only had 5 to 10 years? What if you had a year? What if you had a day? And I think there's nothing like, I mean, historically, spiritually, many traditions, one of the strongest spiritual practices is a kind of meditation on your own mortality.
Yeah.
So.
Great. Yep. And Howard says you nailed it in the intro. Yeah. Good. Thanks. Well, let's talk a little about the history. If anyone wants to add, oh, good. Someone has popped something more. Yeah. Death is a potent teacher. So much true. So much truth in that. I personally find it sort of fascinating that we live in this society that kind of wants to ignore death. And obviously, if you've jumped on this call, you're maybe not one of those people, because it's just so all around us, and yet we want to kind of push it away or push it aside or think, well, not me. And then I think it comes forward often when somebody close to us dies, whether it's a parent or a sibling or a partner or a friend. Something happens in our community of people. Sometimes it's a stranger, and we're touched and we kind of say, oh my God, that could have been me. So how do we plan for that? How do we kind of come to terms with that? I think it's interesting that at a most painful time of someone's passing, there's a lot of added pain on top of it that really doesn't need to be there, right? So the denial and the not planning and the ignoring it and the not having conversations actually just makes the whole thing worse. And somehow we have this idea that it'll be better if we just don't talk about it. But I think that's changing. I think, at the best, there can be a lot of hassle. And at the worst, there can be a lot of trauma and unending pain. So if there's anything we can do to change that, let's do it. Like, why wouldn't we do it? What I think is kind of interesting too is just the history in our country, and maybe some of you know this, but I'll just talk about it briefly because I think it's kind of fascinating. I mean, obviously, embalming has been around for, since the Egyptians, but embalming and the modern funeral industry really was born in this country in the Civil War.
Civil War. Mm-hmm.
So in part, Lincoln was embalmed and was taken on a train on a tour around the country. But even before that, soldiers, when they wanted to send their bodies home, this embalming thing started. And so out of that, because the embalming required some training, then that became kind of like, oh, well, you have to be trained, so you have to have this certification before you can do it. There were all kinds of shysters, there was all kinds of crooked stuff, but it was also the birth of the modern funeral industry as we know it. So if you think about it, I mean, prior to that, every burial was a green burial and every funeral was a home funeral, right? And then it shifted and it became the funeral industry. And I don't want to knock the funeral industry because I think in many ways, obviously, they've taken on a potent and challenging thing that a lot of families needed and wanted help with, or maybe still do. At the same time, there's a lot of people who don't want that and want something very different. So interesting, like casket making, I learned that was a side venture for furniture makers. That was just kind of a natural added business. It wasn't usually that someone went strictly into the coffin business. They were furniture makers and then they happened to make coffins. Coffins were originally mostly wood and then they became metal. And then, of course, metal meant that it had to be manufactured at a different level. And suddenly you've got the coffin industry. And I believe that most coffins in the US are now produced by 2 companies.
Interesting.
So interesting. And of course, all this is changing wildly. There's new legislation in Colorado to do composting. There's a lot of interest in green burial. There's a lot of interest in alternatives to cremation, which of course uses a ton of energy.
I was just going to say, I think I mentioned this to you, Diane, in our call before, and I know some of you on the call are familiar with this. I got connected to a company called Recompose. Kind of accidentally, a client of mine sent me this information. It's an entity that began as a nonprofit in Washington State, is now a for-profit entity. And I had only, before this thing popped up in my inbox, I had said to myself and then out loud to my kids, it would be cool to be like after death actually made into compost and sprinkled rather than ashes. And then up this popped. And so there is this, as to your point, now in Colorado, and I think in California, interestingly, it's had to have been legislated to allow this to be a process by which one's remains are they're put in a container, right? It's all natural. There are no chemicals added. And you are turned into about 1 cubic foot, as I understand it, depending on your size. Sizes will vary, of compost after 30 days. And so it's an interesting, and I think it's cool.
It's very interesting. There's a lot, I think there's a lot changing with it. Oops, I just did a button. Am I still there? Okay.
You're here. But
okay,
that's sort of that. But
up.
The thing where I've experienced it so conflicted and so difficult is not I'm gone. It's I'm on the way to being gone. The loved one on the way to being gone. I think that process is
exactly.
So well prepared for it. I'm speaking for myself. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's where the thing really kind of comes in. Where are you and what do you want? And it isn't just about what happens after. I'll throw in a couple of questions in the side here. It really comes down to, what do you hope for? Do you know what you want? What more do you need to learn, and how will you learn whatever it is you feel like you need to learn more about? And what might you put in place to support your true wishes? Some things we have control over and some things we don't. But without the things in place to support your true wishes, in other words, let me get more concrete. If you really believe that you want to not be on life support and you are in a car accident, you will be on life support unless you have put everything in place to not be on life support. And unless you've had that conversation with your loved ones, it's too difficult a position to put people in the position of being in a hospital trying to make a decision. And do we put them on life support or not? The medical world will push you towards interventions that you may not want unless you have explicitly laid out that you do not want those, right? Living wills, exactly. I'll put up at the end, I'll put up some resources that include like where you can find advanced directives for every state and some very specific things. But what I think is super interesting is that all of us know this, and yet it's sometimes very challenging to actually take the action step to get that in place, right? So what I try to do in the courses that I lead, and in whether it's one-on-one conversations or classes, is kind of really drilling down into, okay, yes, here's what you want. Have you got all the information for what you want? Now, how do you put that in place? So it takes it out of sort of the airy realm of, wishful thinking and into the actual action steps that create a plan. And everybody is different, in terms of what they need to make that happen. My husband and I, for example, we can never get anything done unless we make the appointment with the professional. So if we make the appointment with the attorney, then we will look at the will. Right. Without that appointment, it's just going to be back burner, wishful thinking. We know we need to, gosh, it's so important, and we'll never do it until that appointment is made. So, what's your thing that'll get you to actually do it? What's the motivation?
Well, and I would say that, the documents are important, but I have seen the documents, I wouldn't say fail, but I don't think the documents are, I think you would agree with me, Diane. I don't know that the documents are enough.
They're not foolproof. Yeah.
Meaning, first of all, things can come up very suddenly. And if you haven't really shared your heart with the people who are going to be making those decisions, and if those people aren't in a place where they can let you go,
right,
then, things can get out of, there can be a kind of snowball effect, right?
Absolutely.
In extremis. And the consequence of that can be, who's to say, but it's, I'm thinking about a conversation I've had with a client who wants to gather a group around her of her friends who are likely to be the ones who are making these decisions, and really talk through it and really try and think through various contingencies, because as things happen very rapidly and you're caught in the maw of emergency medical, or maybe even not so much emergency, you have to be so, like, in a sense, spiritually balanced to be in a place of making those decisions. And I think it can be, and sometimes it can just be a slippery slope. I'm thinking of an example of my mother-in-law who fell, broke her shoulder. She's 90, then had a heart attack, is in the hospital. She's very, very present. And she says, and they're saying, we think we should do a heart cath. And she's like, I don't think you should do a heart cath. And the surgeon's like, what do you mean I shouldn't do a heart cath? And she's like, well, what's it going to tell me that I don't already know? And then this is, I'll hit the punchline and then we'll go on. But she says to the surgeon, well, I guess there's the possibility I could die on the table, cheerily. And he says, I don't think that's a good reason to have the heart cath.
Right. And it sounds like she was completely mentally intact, right?
She was.
And could say what she wanted.
Yes.
Which is one scenario, right?
Exactly. The ideal one.
The ideal one. Yeah.
But not one we always get. Yeah.
Not one we always get. Not one we always get. Yes. I think back to this great phrase, like, hope is not a plan.
Right.
I think that is a lovely phrase for this kind of, this kind of thinking. And I guess, let me jump into, though, well, I guess I would say this too. There are many pathways to this kind of exploration, right? And for some people, the thing is they're going to watch YouTube videos and they're going to learn a ton of stuff about whatever they want to learn in terms of practical end of life care paperwork or decisions after death or conversations. There's a really great website called the Conversation Project. And again, I'll throw some of these up later as well. But then there's also this question of sort of yes, and how does what you said at the beginning, Maggie, how does living with a heightened sense of our mortality impact how we live? And what choices would we be making? For most of us, it doesn't mean we'd sell our house and move to the ocean because we always wanted to be by the ocean. I guess that would be, an extreme kind of example. But for some of us, it's just fine tuning. It's just a little bit of clarification of priorities. So, with best 3 months, what I love about the best 3 months process is that we in these classes, we name a date. So the first day of class, we say your date of death is blank, and we name the date. Actually, I figured it out for this group. It is November, I wrote it down somewhere, I think November 18th. If we're taking this group here today, we'd say 90 days from now is November 18th, and on that day you will be gone. And what I find is it's quite interesting for people to kind of sit with that actual number, and
Yes.
it kind of brings you up short. You go, well, that's not really very long, and I have things I need to do. So best 3 months it's just one of a variety of tools that are out there for exploring and clarifying what you want. And in this course, we talk about the physical domain, like physically, what makes you comfortable, what do you love, what do you not love. We talk about the spiritual domain. A part of what I love about that, when you talk about that with a group, is there's a pretty wide range of what people believe and think. And yet, to make space for hearing what people believe and what they want is really lovely. Nobody has to agree with anybody else's beliefs, but sometimes there's some clarification. I'll use an example for myself. I found myself in doing this work. I thought, well, I'd really like at the end of my life to have some guided meditation. Like I really resonate with that. But, I guess I'll email a couple friends and get some suggestions, and maybe I'll go online. Then I was like, oh my God, just download this Sharon Salzberg guided meditation that you love and just start listening to it. Like we make these things so complicated. We add all these steps that don't necessarily need to be there. So I simply picked up my phone, downloaded the Sharon Salzberg meditation instead of emailing friends and trying to drag this whole thing out, and started listening to it. And I'm not sure, without sort of the clarification, I think that would have kept being a thing I was putting off. Like, oh, I know I love guided meditation, but I'll get to it one day. I'll do it the last 3 months of my life, like, are you kidding? Why not now? So that's just like a tiny example of some of these fine tunings that I think we have the opportunity to do. Emotional domain is a really interesting one to talk about with people. I find, for example, a woman in a course this spring, she said, I really have to do something about my relationship with my sister. It fell apart when my mother died. She believes that I kind of, took advantage of some situation, which I didn't do. And I've got to find a way to explain to her and connect with her again. And what was so moving about it is she didn't know what she was going to do. By the end of the class, she still wasn't sure if it was an email or a letter or a phone call, but she was like, I'm determined. I do not want to die with that relationship so unresolved in such a difficult place. Not everybody has something so clear. That was such a clear, stone in the shoe kind of thing that she had to do something about. Life legacy is very interesting. People sometimes hear that and it sounds like some big thing, like, will you name a building after yourself or something? But I think it can be much sweeter than that. I've got one client who's now, she's been a big traveler. And so she made a list of all the countries she went to, and kind of like jotted down a lesson that she learned in each country. And then she's writing about those. And she said it's been so satisfying to take these life lessons that have always been in her and kind of bring them forward. And she doesn't have children, but she has probably a dozen children that she's kind of helped raise, like nieces and nephews and beloved friends. And she said, I want to give them this book and I want to tell them how important it is to travel. So how cool is that? It's small, but it's like she needed that little nudge to get the project actually started. And then after death care, we've kind of already talked about, but again, this idea of there are a lot of options in after death care, and there's a lot of possibility in what is it that you want.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'll pause and see any questions or thoughts.
I think I'm waiting to see if someone, feel free to chat in and I'll chat for a minute myself. I was reflecting the other day, you know, I'm in a bit of a life, you know, about to be 60, you know, had the first grandchild. It's made me rethink where I want to be physically. It's had quite an impact on me. But what I was reflecting on was I've had 2 deaths in my life that really pushed me in a different direction. And I think of them in an odd way as they're terrible losses and yet profound gifts. And the gift part was having to come sort of really up close and personal with mortality and with my own. And the first one occurred when I was in my late 30s. I had a very close friend who dropped dead on the eve of her 35th birthday. And it just really, I think, very much changed the course of my life. And it changed the course of my life, not just because I lost her, but even more profoundly, just the reality of how, even at a young age, a life can get cut short. And, you know, I went to her memorial service and it was beautiful. And there were so many people, and many of whom were friends of hers that I'd never met, but all of them spoke consistently about who she was. She was the same person to all of us in an interesting way, and a very beloved person. And it made me think, I wonder if that would be the case if it were me. I wonder what I should be doing. I wonder, what am I doing exactly? What's my trajectory, etc. And that death led me to Orcas Island, which is where I sit today. That was a long story, but it was instrumental. Mm-hmm. And the second death was my brother, who died quite quickly, 17 months, glioblastoma. And I think he was diagnosed at 59. I know he died not long after his 60th birthday. Okay, so here I am, this age, right? And so like many of my clients, when they think about their own death, they sort of think, well, when did my mom die? Oh, if I live longer than my mom. For me, it's my brother now. It's like, okay, here I am. Will I live longer than my brother? What if I don't? Right. What would that mean? What should I be doing? Where should I be? Where should I be putting my energies? And so I say this as an example of the way that meditation, however it's brought to you, is a profound gift. At least that's been my experience of it. It's clarifying. It's like a tonic, you know.
What was the last thing you said? Say it again.
I said it's clarifying. It's like a tonic, you know. It's like a palate cleanser.
Right. Very true.
So,
and for some of us, I think it's you know, we can think about how do we want. I mean, probably all of us have friends or personal experiences with cancer. All of us have experiences with sudden deaths and slow declines. So I think this is relevant both to, you know, us personally, but also to how we are holding space for others around us and what they're going through. I know my parents are in their 80s, and I think, wow, you know, they're doing so well in their 80s, and what will happen next, and how will their end come, you know, or how will my end come, possibly before theirs, who knows? Let me pop another over in the chat. So this, I think this is just an example of some of the things that I talk about when I go through this best 3 months with people. So if we looked at the physical domain, what I typically do is I give people questions to reflect on, and, you know, anywhere from 10 to 15 kind of questions, but they're questions like this for each domain. So, you know, how would you like to be cared for? Where and how would it feel? And then related to that is what makes you comfortable at peace now and what makes you uncomfortable and anxious now. So this is kind of an interesting way to reflect. And we can take a minute and do that now, checking the time.
Yeah. I would invite, if you feel so moved, to just, and maybe you want to write this down for yourselves and you don't want to put it in the chat, but any of you who care to put it in the chat away. Because, and I think these questions, Diane, are so important, especially when you're thinking about, like, for example, convening a group of friends who might be the ones who have to make decisions for you. This kind of information shared with others is very, very helpful.
Very important. And it's so interesting too, because like I'm a person who I would have thought that I wanted a lot of touch or a lot of music. But when I really sat with these questions, then it was much more like only a little touch, like just maybe at my feet, and no music, like actually silence is what I would want. And you're thinking of this partly in terms of, it's one thing if you can communicate what you want, but what if you cannot communicate? Then have you communicated it in some way ahead of time? If you can't say to your partner, stop rubbing my feet, how have you said to them, just light touch or whatever it is that makes you comfortable and at peace or uncomfortable? So, obviously step one is knowing yourself and reflecting and taking the time to reflect. Step two is communicating whatever important pieces of that need to be put out.
Yeah, exactly.
While people are sort of thinking about that, and again, that's kind of an example. Let me throw up some other resources, because I just think there's so much out there. These are some of my favorite books. Being Mortal, maybe some people have already read that.
I love that book.
Stunning, beautiful, so readable book. And it's really about that. If anyone hasn't read it, it's about the big trajectory of kind of what has happened in our country with this medicalized end. And he's a physician, the author, and he has written so beautifully about it, reflected so beautifully about it. Then Katie Butler has this wonderful book called The Art of Dying Well. I'm sorry I didn't bring it to hold up and show you. I think it picks up right where Being Mortal leaves off, and it's very pragmatic. What I love about The Art of Dying Well is that it's divided into chapters where you'd only have to read the chapters that are relevant to you or your loved one if you want. And so it's things like every chapter begins with a description and every chapter ends with suggestions. So the description might be, you can still do everything by yourself. You don't need any help. You're good to go. You're in midlife and you're fine. The suggestions at the end will be complete your paperwork, talk to people, start to think about long-term where to best be living, that kind of thing. But then as it progresses, it becomes, one of the chapters is called The House of Cards. This is the stage where one fall can lead to the end, or absolutely. One poor outcome with pneumonia, that kind of thing. And that's a different description at the beginning, and it's a different set of suggestions at the end. And I love it's connected to slow medicine, if people are familiar with that phrase. There's apparently a fabulous slow medicine Facebook group, which I'm not involved with at the moment, but I've just heard about it. And so the idea is, in this Art of Dying Well, how do you find the right physician who will really take time with you, who's no longer treating you as someone who's fixable, but someone who's just managing symptoms and helping keep things as comfortable as possible in whatever time you have left. Another great resource here, Caitlin Dowdy. Are people familiar with her? Oh my gosh. Caitlin is a big disruptor for the funeral industry. She's so much fun. She's got a huge YouTube channel called Ask a Mortician. And she went into she worked at a cremation site and wrote a book called When Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. And then she wrote a fabulous book called From Here to Eternity. She's just really interesting. Oh, great. Yeah, we'll send out this text string because I'll throw some other things up here. Caitlin Dowdy she's like the millennial face of what is happening. And when you see some of her stuff, you will be like, oh my gosh. Yes, I think storing this kind of information with your will is fabulous. I encourage people to have like an old-fashioned manila folder that's titled like When I Die, and just stick stuff in it. I mean, sometimes even just like sticking a favorite copy of a poem in there can help somebody when they're trying to design a funeral. I know my aunt died last summer. She had never told her children or her husband anything about what she wanted. They were making it up from scratch and they had no idea. So yeah, some kind of specific spot to store some things, whether it's electronic or, electronic or just hard copy.
That reminds me of something. Liz, if you don't mind popping on a minute, didn't your father have a folder? I'm remembering something about how it was labeled.
Yes, he had a folder that was called "Death, in case of."
There you go, death.
It was very helpful. So
I love that.
Terrific. I threw up some more websites. My website is Best Life, Best Death. There's more resources and things on there. Order of the Good Death. Oops, that should be a dot, not a comma. Order of the Good Death is about making death a part of your life. That's Caitlin Dowdy. The Conversation Project, whenyouDie.org, study of consciousness, super interesting stuff there. Home funerals, water cremation, printable advance directives by state, and writing your own obituary. I mean, again, there's just so many interesting angles to go with all of this.
The one thing I want to ask a question of you, though, about
Sure.
this. So it seems to me that there are moments of clarity that make things easier. And what I mean by that is, okay, you've died. Well, that's a moment of clarity. So hopefully you've put, if you put down what you want, but it's a post-death thing. And then there's, okay, it is clear that you are dying and you're in palliative care, which for some people happens 5 minutes before, and some people happens 6 months or a year before.
Yes.
And then there's that line between how you're deciding how far to go with interventions and with what interventions are sold to you, for lack of a better term. And I don't mean that necessarily just cynically, but I mean they're proposed to you because it might elongate your life in some form or fashion, or because it might help somebody else in the case of experimental treatment, or because it might ease your pain. And that discernment, that muddy middle, that seems to me to be how one prepares for those sorts of discernments, and who you have around you and how you do it. I feel like that's where I've seen it be really, really difficult.
I think it's really difficult. And I think the challenge is too, like you think about how not everybody is on the same page. There's kind of, they joke about the seagull syndrome, which is the child who flies in from far away and shits all over everything, right? You've got,
right.
So it's like, you can be with a dying parent kind of feeling like you're on the same page, and then have a sibling arrive and everything goes to hell because different opinions are there, and people are at different places of acceptance and different places of fear and different places of choice. And that, I think, is the really big challenge. So I think sometimes the dying person is more accepting than the people who are alive. And there's a wonderful nurse named, one of the real founders of hospice, named Barbara Carnes. And Barbara Carnes talks about how often, a person at the end of their life is often staying alive for the people who are living, and kind of trying to help them come to terms with it. And I think those are such gray areas. And like you said, Maggie, it really does depend who is around, what are the conversations, what are the qualities of the conversation, what's the depth of the conversation. And all of that boils down to how willing are people to face this final transition for themselves and for the other.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And it's so personal. It's so personal. And I always feel like, well, I don't know what I would do until I was there. I think that I would make certain choices, but I might make different choices if I was standing and facing those choices.
Right.
But I always remember that in Being Mortal, Atul Gawande talks about, he has a thread of one young woman that he follows through the book, and she's maybe 35 and has a terrible cancer. And what he ultimately says is, he says, we failed her. We, her doctors, failed her because she did not know she was dying. And she did not face her own mortality because we made her believe that she could beat it. And it wasn't until, I feel like it was a couple days before she died, that she realized she was terminal. Yeah. And he just sees that as a stunning failure. And I do too. It just seems like that is not a truth that should be so put off.
Yeah. Boy, it's rough.
Yeah.
It's very rough. I'm inclined to want, we've got about a little more than 10 minutes left, and I'm inclined to
Yeah.
want to allow others to join the conversation.
Totally.
And I guess you can do it one of two ways. Some of you may be more comfortable talking. If you want to, this is being recorded, so that's your choice if you want to talk or if you want to reveal show yourselves on camera. It's okay with us if it's okay with you. Or conversely, we could end the presentation right now and stop the recording and just open it out if people would feel more comfortable. And that may be the better solution given this. So
Sure.
I think I'm going to make an executive decision. Let's
Sure.
go ahead and stop the recording for now. We thank
Great.
you all who are watching the recording, and we encourage you to look up these resources, which will also be on our website.